Chapter 11. We descry the wagon, get into it, arrive at an inn, our fellow travelers described. A mistake is committed by Strap, which produces strange things. We traveled half a mile without exchanging one word. My thoughts being engrossed by the knavery of the world, to which I must be daily exposed, and the contemplation of my finances, which began sensibly to diminish. At length, Strap, who could hold no longer, addressed me thus: "Well, fools and their money are soon parted. If my advice had been taken, that old skinflint should have been D—and before he had got more than the third of his demand. 'Tis a sure sign you came easily by your money, when you squander it away in this manner. God help you, how many bristly beards must I have mowed before I earned 4 shillings and 3 halfpenny, which is all thrown to the dogs? How many days have I sat weaving hair till my toes were numbed by the cold, my fingers cramped, and my nose as blue as the sign of the periwig that hung over the door? What the devil was you afraid of? I would have engaged to box with any one of those fellows who came in for a guinea. I'm sure I have beat stouter men than either of them. And, indeed, my companion would have fought anybody when his life was in no danger, but he had a mortal aversion to firearms and all instruments of death. In order to appease him, I assured him no part of this extraordinary expense should fall upon his shoulders, at which declaration he was affronted, and told me he would have me to know that, although he was a poor barber's boy, yet he had a soul to spend big money with the best squire of the land. Having walked all day at a great pace, without halting for a refreshment, we descried, toward the evening, to our inexpressible joy, the wagon about 1/4 of a mile before us. And by that time we reached it, were both of us so weary that I verily believe it would have been impracticable for us to have walked 1 mile farther. We, therefore, bargained with the driver, whose name was Joey, to give us a cast to the next stage for 1 shilling, at which place we should meet the master of the wagon, with whom we might agree for the rest of the journey. Accordingly, the convenience stopped, and Joey, having placed the ladder, Strap, being loaded with our baggage, mounted first. But just as he was getting in, a tremendous voice assailed his ears in these words: "God's fury! There shall no passengers come here." The poor shaver was so disconcerted at this exclamation, which both he and I imagined proceeded from the mouth of a giant, that he descended with great velocity and a countenance as white as paper. Joey, perceiving our astonishment, called, with an arch sneer, "Wans, Copton, way won't yow suffer the poor wagoner to make a penny? Coom, young man, get oop, never mind the Copton, I'se not afeard of the Copton." This was not encouragement sufficient to Strap, who could not be prevailed upon to venture up again, upon which I attempted, though not without a quaking heart, when I heard the same voice muttering, like distant thunder, "Hell and the devil confound me, if I don't make you smart for this." However, I crept in, and by accident got an empty place in the straw, which I immediately took possession of, without being able to discern the faces of my fellow travelers in the dark. Strap, following with the knapsack on his back, chanced to take the other side, and by a jolt of the carriage pitched directly upon the stomach of the captain, who bellowed out in a most dreadful manner, "Blood and thunder! Where's my sword?" At these words my frighted comrade started up, and at one spring bounced against me with such force that I thought he was the supposed son of Anak, who intended to press me to death. In the meantime a female voice cried, "Bless me!" "What is the matter, my dear?" "The matter," replied the captain, "and my blood. My guts are squeezed into a pancake by that Scotchman's hump." Strap, trembling all the while at my back, asked him pardon, and laid the blame of what had happened upon the jolting of the wagon, and the woman who spoke before went on, Ay, my dear, it is our own fault. We may thank ourselves for all the inconveniences we meet with. I thank God I never traveled so before. I am sure if my lady or Sir John were to know where we are, they would not sleep this night for vexation. I wish to God we had writ for the chariot. I know we shall never be forgiven. Come, my dear, replied the captain. It don't signify fretting now. We shall laugh it over as a frolic. I hope you will not suffer in your health. I shall make my lord very merry with our adventures in this diligence. The discourse gave me such a high notion of the captain and his lady that I durst not venture to join in the conversation. But immediately after another female voice began. Some people give themselves a great many needless airs. Better folks than any here have traveled in wagons before now. Some of us have rode in coaches and chariots, with 3 footmen behind them, without making so much fuss about it. What then? We are now all upon a footing, therefore let us be sociable and merry. What do you say, Isaac? Is not this a good motion, you doting rogue? Speak, you old cent-per-cent fornicator. What desperate debt are you thinking of? What mortgage are you planning? Well, Isaac, positively you shall never gain my favor till you turn over a new leaf, grow honest, and live like a gentleman. In the meantime, give me a kiss, you old fumbler. These words, accompanied with a hearty smack, enlivened the person to whom they were addressed to such a degree that he cried, in transport, though with a faltering voice, "Ah! You wanton baggage, upon my credit, you are a waggish girl. He. This laugh introduced a fit of coughing, which almost suffocated the poor usurer. Such we afterwards found was the profession of this our fellow travelers. About this time I fell asleep, and enjoyed a comfortable nap till such time as we arrived at the inn where we put up. Here, having alighted from the wagon, I had an opportunity of viewing the passengers in order as they entered. The first who appeared was a brisk, airy girl, about 20 years old, with a silver-laced hat on her head instead of a cap, a blue stuff riding suit, trimmed with silver very much tarnished, and a whip in her hand. After her came, limping, an old man with a worsted nightcap buttoned under his chin, and a broad-brimmed hat slouched over it, an old rusty blue cloak tied about his neck, under which appeared a brown surtout that covered a threadbare coat and waistcoat, and as he afterwards discerned, a dirty flannel jacket. His eyes were hollow, bleared, and gummy. His face was shriveled into 1,000 wrinkles. His gums were destitute of teeth, his nose sharp and drooping, his chin peaked and prominent, so that when he mumped or spoke, they approached one another like a pair of nutcrackers. He supported himself on an ivory-headed cane, and his whole figure was a just emblem of winter, famine, and avarice. But how was I surprised when I beheld the formidable captain in the shape of a little thin creature, about the age of 40, with a long, withered visage, very much resembling that of a baboon, through the upper part of which 2 little gray eyes peeped. He wore his own hair in a queue that reached to his rump, which immoderate length, I suppose, was the occasion of a baldness that appeared on the crown of his head when he deigned to take off his hat, which was very much of the size and cock of pistol. S. Having laid aside his greatcoat, I could not help admiring the extraordinary make of this man of war. He was about 5 feet and 3 inches high, 16 inches of which went to his face and long, scraggy neck. His thighs were about 6 inches in length, his legs resembling spindles or drumsticks, 5 feet and a half, and his body, which put me in mind of extension without substance, engrossed the remainder. So that on the whole, he appeared like a spider or grasshopper erect, and was almost a vox et praeterea nihil. His dress consisted of a frock of what is called bearskin, the skirts of which were about half a foot long, an hussar waistcoat, scarlet breeches reaching halfway down his thighs, worsted stockings rolled up almost to his groin, and shoes with wooden heels at least 2 inches high. He carried a sword very near as long as himself in one hand, and with the other conducted his lady, who seemed to be a woman of his own age, and still retained some remains of an agreeable person, but so ridiculously affected that, had I not been a novice in the world, I might have easily perceived in her the deplorable vanity and second-hand airs of a lady's woman. We were all assembled in the kitchen, when Captain Weasel, for that was his name, desired a room with a fire for himself and spouse, and told the landlord they would up by themselves. The innkeeper replied that he could not afford them a room by themselves, and as for supping, he had prepared victuals for the passengers in the wagon, without respect of persons, but if he could prevail on the rest to let him have his choice in a separate manner, he should be very well pleased. This was no sooner said than all of us declared against the proposal, and Miss Jenny, our other female passenger, observed that, if Captain Weasel and his lady had a mind to sup by themselves, they might wait until we should have done. At this hint the captain put on a martial frown and looked very big without speaking, while his yokefellow, with a disdainful toss of her nose, muttered something about creature, which Miss Jenny, overhearing, stepped up to her, saying, "None of your names, good missus." "Abigail." "Creature, quotha, I'll assure you no such creature as you neither, no 10-pound sneaker, no quality coupler." Here the captain interposed, with a D.E. "Madam, what do you mean by that?" "D.N. you, sir, who are you?" replied Miss Jenny. "Who made you a captain, you pitiful, trencher-scraping, pimping curler?" "Death. The army is come to a fine pass, when such fellows as you get commissions." "What, I suppose you think I don't know you?" "Egad, you and your helpmate are well met. A cast-off mistress and a bald valeted chamber are well yoked together." "Blood and wounds," cried Weasel. "D'ye question the honor of my wife, madam?" "Helen D. Iron." "No man in England durst say so much. I would flay him, carbonado him." "Fury and destruction." "I would have his liver for my supper." So saying, he drew his sword and flourished with it, to the great terror of Strap, while Miss Jenny, snapping her fingers, told him she did not value his resentment a louse. In the midst of this quarrel, the master of the wagon alighted, who, understanding the cause of the disturbance, and fearing the captain and his lady would take umbrage and leave his carriage, was at great pains to have everything made up, which he at last accomplished, and we sat down to supper altogether. At bedtime we were shown to our apartments, the old usurer, Strap, and I to one room, the captain, his wife, and Miss Jenny to another. About midnight, my companion's bowels being disordered, he got up in order to go backward, but in his return, mistaking one door for another, entered Weasel's chamber, and without any hesitation went to bed to his wife, who was fast asleep, the captain being at another end of the room groping for some empty vessel, in lieu of his own chamber pot, which was leaky. As he did not perceive Strap coming in, he went towards his own bed, after having found a convenience. But no sooner did he feel a rough head, covered with a cotton nightcap, than it came into his mind that he had mistaken Miss Jenny's bed instead of his own, and that the head he felt was that of some gallant, with whom she had made an assignation. Full of his conjecture, and scandalized at the prostitution of his apartment, he snatched up the vessel he had just before filled, and emptied it at once on the astonished barber and his own wife, who, waking at that instant, broke forth into lamentable cries, which not only alarmed the husband beyond measure, but frighted poor Strap almost out of his senses. For he verily believed himself bewitched, especially when the incensed captain seized him by the throat, with a volley of oaths, asking him how he durst have the presumption to attempt the chastity of his wife. Poor Strap was so amazed and confounded that he could say nothing but, "I take God to witness she's a virgin for me, Mrs." Weasel, enraged to find herself in such a pickle through the precipitation of her husband, arose in her shift, and with the heel of her shoe which she found by the bedside, belabored the captain's bald pate till he roared murder. "I'll teach you to empty your stinkpots on me," cried she, "you pitiful hop-o'-my-thumb coxcomb. What, I warrant you're jealous, you man of lath. Was it for this I condescended to take you to my bed, you poor, withered, sapless twig?" The noise occasioned by this adventure had brought the master of the wagon and me to the door, where we overheard all that passed with great satisfaction. In the meantime, we were alarmed with the cry of rape. Murder. Rape, which Jenny pronounced with great vociferation. "Oh, you vile, abominable old villain," said she, "would you rob me of my virtue? But I'll be revenged of you, you old goat. I will, help, for heaven's sake, help. I shall be ravished, ruined. Help!" Some servants of the inn, hearing this cry, came running upstairs with lights, and such weapons as chance afforded, when we beheld a very diverting scene. In one corner stood the poor captain shivering in his shirt, which was all torn to rags, with a woeful visage, scratched all over by his wife, who had by this time wrapped the counterpane about her, and sat sobbing on the side of her bed. At the other end lay the old usurer, sprawling on Miss Jenny's bed, with his flannel jacket over his shirt, and his tawny, meager limbs exposed to the air, while she held him fast by the 2 ears and loaded him with execrations. When he asked what was the matter, she affected to weep, told us she was afraid that wicked rogue had ruined her in her sleep, and bade us take notice of what we saw, for she intended to make use of our evidence against him. The poor wretch looked like one more dead than alive, and begged to be released, a favor which he had no sooner obtained than he protested she was no woman, but a devil incarnate, that she had first seduced his flesh to rebel, and then betrayed him. "Yes, cockatrice," continued he, "you know you laid this snare for me, but you shan't succeed, for I will hang myself before you shall get a farthing of me." So saying, he crawled to his own bed, groaning all the way. We then advanced to the captain, who told us, "Gentlemen, here has been a d mistake, but I'll be revenged on him who was the cause of it. That Scotchman who carries the knapsack shall not breathe this vital air another day, if my name be Weasel. My dear, I ask you 10,000 pardons. You are sensible I could mean no harm to you." "I know not what you meant," replied she, sighing, "but I know I have got enough to send me to my grave." At length they were reconciled. The wife was complimented with a share of Miss Jenny's bed, her own being overflowed, and the master of the wagon invited Weasel to sleep the remaining part of the night with him. I retired to mine, where I found Strap mortally afraid, he having stolen away in the dark while the captain and his lady were at loggerheads. Chapter 12. Captain Weasel challenges Strap, who declines the combat, an affair between the captain and me. The usurer is fain to give Miss Jenny 5 guineas for a release. We are in danger of losing a meal. The behavior of Weasel, Jenny, and Joey on that occasion. An account of Captain Weasel and his lady. The captain's courage tried. Isaac's mirth at the captain's expense next morning. I agreed to give the master of the wagon 10 shillings for my passage to London, provided Strap should be allowed to take my place when I should be disposed to walk. At the same time, I desired him to appease the incensed captain, who had entered the kitchen with a drawn sword in his hand, and threatened with many oaths to sacrifice the villain who attempted to violate his bed. But it was to no purpose for the master to explain the mistake and assure him of the poor lad's innocence, who stood trembling behind me all the while. The more submission that appeared in Strap, the more implacable seemed the resentment of Weasel, who swore he must either fight him or he would instantly put him to death. I was extremely provoked at this insolence, and told him it could not be supposed that a poor barber lad would engage a man of the sword at his own weapon, but I was persuaded he would wrestle or box with him. To which proposal Strap immediately gave assent by saying he would box with him for a guinea. Weasel replied with a look of disdain that it was beneath any gentleman of his character to fight like a porter, or even to put himself on a footing in any respect with such a fellow as Strap. "Odds bodykins," cries Joey, "sure, Copton, y'all would not commit murder. Here's a poor lad that is willing to make atonement for his offense, and in that won't satisfy yaw, offers to fight yaw fairly. And yaw won't box, I dare say, he will cudgel with yaw." "Won't yaw, my lad?" Strap, after some hesitation, answered, Yes, I'll cudgel with him." But this expedient being also rejected by the captain, I began to smell his character, and, tipping Strap the wink, told the captain that I had always heard it said, "The person who receives a challenge should have the choice of the weapons." This therefore being the rule in point of honor, I would venture to promise on the head of my companion that he would even fight Captain Weasel at sharps. But it should be with such sharps as Strap was best acquainted with, namely, razors. At my mentioning razors, I could perceive the captain's color change while Strap, pulling me by the sleeve, whispered with great eagerness, No, for the love of God, don't make any such bargain." At length Weasel, recovering himself, turned towards me, and with a ferocious countenance asked, "Who the devil are you? Will you fight me?" With these words, putting himself in a posture, I was grievously alarmed at seeing the point of a sword within half a foot of my breast, and, springing to one side, snatched up a spit that stood in the chimney corner, with which I kept my formidable adversary at bay, who made a great many half-lunges, skipping backward at every push, till at last I pinned him up in a corner, to the no small diversion of the company. While he was in this situation, his wife entered, and, seeing her husband in these dangerous circumstances, uttered a dreadful scream. In this emergency, Weasel demanded a cessation, which was immediately granted, and at last was contented with the submission of Strap, who, falling on his knees before him, protested the innocence of his intention, and asked pardon for the mistake he had committed. This affair being ended without bloodshed, we went to breakfast, but missed two of our company, namely, Miss Jenny and the usurer. As for the first, Mrs. Weasel informed us that she had kept her awake all night with her groans, and that when she rose in the morning, Miss Jenny was so much indisposed that she could not proceed on her journey. At that instant, a message came from her to the master of the wagon, who immediately went into her chamber, followed by us all. She told him in a lamentable tone that she was afraid of a miscarriage, owing to the fright she received last night from the brutality of Isaac, and, as the event was uncertain, desired the usurer might be detained to answer for the consequence. Accordingly, this ancient Tarquin was found in the wagon, whither he had retired to avoid the shame of last night's disgrace, and brought by force into her presence. He no sooner appeared than she began to weep and sigh most piteously, and told us, if she died, she would leave her blood upon the head of that ravisher. Poor Isaac turned up his eyes and hands to heaven, prayed that God would deliver him from the machinations of that Jezebel, and assured us, with tears in his eyes, that his being found in bed with her was the result of her own invitation. The wagoner, understanding the case, advised Isaac to make it up by giving her a sum of money, to which advice he replied with great vehemence, "A sum of money! A halter for the cockatrice." "Oh, 'tis very well," said Miss Jenny, I see it is in vain to attempt that flinty heart of his by fair means. Joey, be so good as to go to the justice, and tell him there is a sick person here who wants to see him on an affair of consequence." At the name of Justice, Isaac trembled, and bidding Joey stay, asked with a quavering voice what she would have. She told him that, as he had not perpetrated his wicked purpose, she would be satisfied with a small matter. And though the damage she might sustain in her health might be irreparable, she would give him a release for 100 guineas. 100 guineas, cried he in an ecstasy, 100 furies. Where should a poor old wretch like me have 100 guineas? If I had so much money, do ya think I should be found traveling in a wagon at this season of the year? Come, come, replied Jenny, none of your miserly artifice here. You think I don't know Isaac Rappin, the money broker in the Minories? Ah, you old rogue. Many a pawn have you had of me and my acquaintance, which was never redeemed. Isaac, finding it was in vain to disguise himself, offered 20 shillings for a discharge, which she absolutely refused under 50 pounds. At last, however, she was brought down to 5, which he paid with great reluctancy, rather than be prosecuted for a rape. After which accommodation, the sick person made a shift to get into the wagon, and we set forward in great tranquillity, Strap being accommodated with Joey's horse, the driver himself choosing to walk. The morning and forenoon we were entertained with an account of the valor of Captain Weasel, who told us he had once knocked down a soldier that made game of him, tweaked a drawer by the nose, who found fault with his picking his teeth with a fork at another time, and that he had moreover challenged a cheesemonger, who had the presumption to be his rival, for the truth of which exploits he appealed to his wife. She confirmed whatever he said, and observed, "The last affair happened that very day on which I received a love letter from Squire Gobble, and don't you remember, my dear, I was prodigiously sick that very night with eating ortolans, when my Lord Diddle took notice of my complexion being altered, and my lady was so alarmed that she had well-nigh fainted." "Yes, my dear," replied the captain. "You know my lord said to me with a sneer, 'Billy, Mrs. Weasel is certainly breeding.' And I answered cavalierly, 'My lord, I wish I could return the compliment.' Upon which the whole company broke out into an immoderate fit of laughter, and my lord, who loves a repartee dearly, came round and bussed me. We travelled in this manner 5 days, without interruption or meeting anything worth notice. Miss Jenny, who soon recovered her spirits, entertaining us every day with diverting songs, of which she could sing a great number, and rallying her own gallant, who, notwithstanding, would never be reconciled to her. On the 6th day, while we were about to sit down to dinner, the innkeeper came and told us that 3 gentlemen, just arrived, had ordered the victuals to be carried to their apartment, although he had informed them that they were bespoke by the passengers in the wagon. To which information they had replied, the passengers in the wagon might be their betters must be served before them. They supposed it would be no hardship on such travelers to dine upon bread and cheese for 1 day. This was a terrible disappointment to us all, and we laid our heads together how to remedy it, when Miss Jenny observed that Captain Weasel, being by profession a soldier, ought in this case to protect and prevent us from being insulted. But the captain excused himself, saying he would not for all the world be known to have travelled in a wagon, swearing at the same time that could he appear with honour, they should eat his sword sooner than his provision. Upon this declaration, Miss Jenny, snatching his weapon, drew it, and ran immediately into the kitchen, where she threatened to put the cook to death if he did not send the victuals into our chamber immediately. The noise she made brought the 3 strangers down, one of whom no sooner perceived her than he cried, "Ha! Jenny Ramper! What the devil brought thee hither?" "My dear Jack Rattle," replied she, running into his arms, "is it you?" Then Weasel may go to hell for a dinner. I shall dine with you." They consented to this proposal with a great deal of joy, and we were on the point of being reduced to a very uncomfortable meal, when Joey, understanding the whole affair, entered the kitchen with a pitchfork in his hand, and swore he would be the death of any man who should pretend to seize the victuals prepared for the wagon. The menace had like to have produced fatal consequences, the three strangers drawing their swords and being joined by their servants, and we ranging ourselves on the side of Joey, when the landlord, interposing, offered to part with his own dinner to keep the peace, which was accepted by the strangers, and we sat down at table without any further molestation. In the afternoon, I chose to walk along with Joey, and Strap took my place. Having entered into a conversation with this driver, I soon found him to be a merry, facetious, good-natured fellow, and withal very arch. He informed me that Miss Jenny was a common girl upon the town, who, falling into company with a recruiting officer, he carried her down in the stage coach from London to Newcastle, where he had been arrested for debt, and was now in prison, upon which she was fain to return to her former way of life by this conveyance. He told me likewise that one of the gentleman's servants, who were left at the inn, having accidentally seen Weasel, immediately knew him, and acquainted Joey with some particulars of his character. That he had served my Lord Frizzle in quality of valet-de-chamber many years, while he lived separate from his lady. But upon their reconciliation, she expressly insisted upon Weasel's being turned off, as well as the woman he kept, when his lordship, to get rid of them both with a good grace, proposed that he should marry his mistress, and he would procure a commission for him in the army. This expedient was agreed to, and Weasel is now, by his lordship's interest, ensigned in 's regiment. I found he and I had the same sentiments with regard to Weasel's courage, which he resolved to put to the trial, by alarming the passengers with the cry of a highwayman, as soon as a horseman should appear. This scheme we put in practice, towards the dusk, when we descried a man on horseback approaching us. Joey had no sooner intimated to the people in the wagon that he was afraid we should be all robbed than a general consternation arose. Strap jumped out of the wagon and hid himself behind a hedge. The usurer put forth ejaculations and made a rustling among the straw, which made us conjecture he had hid something under it. Mrs. Weasel, wringing her hands, uttered lamentable cries, and the captain, to our great amazement, began to snore. But this artifice did not succeed, for Miss Jenny, shaking him by the shoulder, bawled out, "Esdeath! Captain, is this a time to snore, when we are going to be robbed? Get up for shame, and behave like a soldier and man of honor." Weasel pretended to be in a great passion for being disturbed, and swore he would have his nap out if all the highwaymen in England surrounded him. "'Sd and my blood, what are you afraid of?" continued he, at the same time trembling with such agitation that the whole carriage shook. This singular piece of behavior incensed Miss Ramper so much that she cried, "D, and your pitiful soul, you are as arrant a poltroon as ever was drummed out of a regiment. Stop the wagon, Joey. Let me out, and by G.D., if I have rhetoric enough, the thief shall not only take your purse, but your skin also." So saying, she leaped out with great agility. By this time the horseman came up, and happened to be a gentleman's servant well known to Joey, who communicated the scheme, and desired him to carry it on a little further, by going into the wagon and questioning those within. The stranger, consenting for the sake of diversion, approached it, and in a terrible tone demanded, "Who have we got here?" Isaac replied with a lamentable voice, "Here's a poor miserable sinner, who has got a small family to maintain, and nothing in the world wherewithal but these 15 shillings, which if you rob me of we must all starve together." "Who's that sobbing in the other corner?" said the supposed highwayman. "A poor unfortunate woman," answered Mrs. Weasel, "upon whom I beg you for Christ's sake to have compassion." "Are you maid or wife?" said he. "Wife to my sorrow," said she. "Who or where is your husband?" continued he. "My husband," replied Mrs. Weasel, "is an officer in the army and was left sick at the last in where we dined." "You must be mistaken, madam," said he, "for I myself saw him get into the wagon this afternoon." "But pray what smell is that?" "Sure your lapdog has befouled himself. Let me catch hold of the nasty cur, I'll teach him better manners." Here he laid hold of one of Weasel's legs and pulled him out from under his wife's petticoat, where he had concealed himself. The poor trembling captain, being detected in his inglorious situation, rubbed his eyes, and affecting to wake out of sleep, cried, "What's the matter?" "What's the matter? The matter is not much," answered the horseman. "I only called in to inquire after your health, and so adieu, most noble captain." He clapped spurs to his horse and was out of sight in a moment. It was some time before Weasel could recollect himself, but at length reassuming the big look, he said, "D—n the fellow." Why did he ride away before I had time to ask him how his lord and lady do? "Don't you remember Tom, my dear?" addressing himself to his wife. "Yes," replied she, "I think I do remember something of the fellow, but you know I seldom converse with people of his station." "Heyday!" cried Joey. "Do yaw gnaw the young moan, Copton?" "Know him," said Weasel. "Many a time has he filled a glass of Burgundy for me at my Lord Trippett's table." "And what may his name be, Copton?" said Joey. His name," replied Weasel, "is Tom Rincer." "Wands," cried Joey, "a has changed his own name then." For Izzy lay a wager he was christened John Trotter. This observation raised a laugh against the captain, who seemed very much disconcerted, when Isaac broke silence and said, "It is no matter who or what he was, since he has not proved the robber we suspected, and we ought to bless God for our narrow escape." "Bless God," said Weasel. "Bless the devil." "For what?" "Had he been a highwayman, I should have eaten his blood, body, and guts before he had robbed me or anyone in this diligence." "Ha, ha, ha," cried Miss Jenny. "I believe you will eat all you kill, indeed, Captain." The usurer was so well pleased at the event of this adventure that he could not refrain from being severe, and took notice that Captain Weasel seemed to be a good Christian, for he had armed himself with patience and resignation instead of carnal weapons, and worked out his salvation with fear and trembling. This piece of satire occasioned a great deal of mirth at Weasel's expense, who muttered a great many oaths, and threatened to cut Isaac's throat. The usurer, taking hold of this menace, said, "Gentlemen and ladies, I take you all to witness that my life is in danger from this bloody-minded officer. I'll have him bound over to the peace." This second sneer produced another laugh against him, and he remained crestfallen during the remaining part of our journey. Chapter 13. Strap and I are terrified by an apparition, Strap's conjecture. The mystery explained by Joey, we arrive in London. Our dress and appearance described, we are insulted in the street, an adventure in an alehouse, we are imposed upon by a waggish footman, set to rights by a tobacconist, take lodgings, dive for a dinner. An accident at our ordinary, we arrived at our inn, supped, and went to bed. But Strap's distemper continuing, he was obliged to rise in the middle of the night, and taking the candle in his hand, which he had left burning for the purpose, he went down to the house of office, whence in a short time he returned in a great hurry, with his hair standing on end, and a look betokening horror and astonishment. Without speaking a word, he set down the light and jumped into bed behind me, where he lay and trembled with great violence. When I asked him what was the matter, he replied, with a broken accent, "God have mercy on us. I have seen the devil. Though my prejudice was not quite so strong as his, I was not a little alarmed at this exclamation, and much more so when I heard the sound of bells approaching our chamber, and felt my bedfellow cling close to me, uttering these words, "Christ have mercy upon us! There he comes!" At that instant, a monstrous, overgrown raven entered our chamber, with bells at his feet, and made directly towards our bed. As this creature is reckoned in our country a common vehicle for the devil and witches to play their pranks in, I verily believed we were haunted, and, in a violent fright, shrank under the bedclothes. This terrible apparition leaped upon the bed, and after giving us several severe dabs with its beak through the blankets, hopped away and vanished. Strap and I recommended ourselves to the protection of heaven with great devotion, and when we no longer heard the noise, ventured to peep up and take breath. But we had not been long freed from this phantom, when another appeared that had well-nigh deprived us both of our senses. We perceived an old man enter the room, with a long white beard that reached to his middle. There was a certain wild peculiarity in his eyes and countenance that did not savor of this world, and his dress consisted of a brown stuff coat, buttoned behind and at the wrists, with an odd-fashioned cap of the same stuff upon his head. I was so amazed that I had not power to move my eyes from such a ghastly object, but lay motionless and saw him come straight up to me. When he reached the bed, he wrung his hands and cried, with a voice that did not seem to belong to a human creature, "Where is Ralph?" I made no reply, upon which he repeated in an accent still more preternatural, "Where is Ralpho?" He had no sooner pronounced these words than I heard the sound of the bells at a distance, which the apparition, having listened to, tripped away, and left me almost petrified with fear. It was a good while before I could recover myself so far as to speak, and when at length I turned to Strap, I found him in a fit, which, however, did not last long. When he came to himself, I asked his opinion of what had happened, and he assured me that the first must certainly be the soul of some person damned, which appeared by the chain about his legs, for his fears had magnified the creature to the bigness of a horse, and the sound of small Morris bells to the clanking of massy chains. As for the old man, he took it to be the spirit of somebody murdered long ago in this place, which had power granted to torment the assassin in the shape of a raven, and that Ralpho was the name of the said murderer. Although I had not much faith in this interpretation, I was too much troubled to enjoy any sleep, and in all my future adventures never passed a night so ill. In the morning Strap imparted the whole affair to Joey, who, after an immoderate fit of laughter, explained the matter by telling him that the old man was the landlord's father, who had been an idiot some years, and diverted himself with a tame raven, which, it seems, had hopped away from his apartment in the night, and induced him to follow it to our chamber, where he had inquired after it under the name of Ralpho. Nothing remarkable happened during the remaining part of our journey, which continued 6 or 7 days longer. At length we entered the great city, and lodged all night at the inn where the wagon put up. Next morning all the passengers parted different ways, while my companion and I sallied out to inquire for the Member of Parliament, to whom I had a letter of recommendation from Mr. Crabbe. As we had discharged our lodging at the inn, Strap took up our baggage and marched behind me in the street with the knapsack on his back, as usual, so that we made a very whimsical appearance. I had dressed myself to the greatest advantage, that is, put on a clean ruffled shirt and my best thread stockings. My hair, which was of the deepest red, hung down upon my shoulders, as lank and straight as a pound of candles, and the skirts of my coat reached to the middle of my leg. My waistcoat and breeches were of the same piece and cut in the same taste, and my hat very much resembled a barber's basin in the shallowness of the crown and narrowness of the brim. Strap was habited in a much less awkward manner, but a short crop-eared wig that very much resembled Scrub S in the play, and the knapsack on his back added to what is called a queer fizz, occasioned by a long chin, a hook nose, and high cheekbones, rendered him, on the whole, a very fit subject of mirth and pleasantry. As he walked along, Strap, at my desire, inquired of a carman whom we met, whereabouts Mr. Cringer lived, and was answered by a stare, accompanied with the word "onnen," upon which I came up in order to explain the question, but had the misfortune to be unintelligible likewise, the carman damning us for a lousy Scotch guard, whipping his horses with a gee-ho, which nettled me to the quick, and roused the indignation of Strap so far that, after the fellow was gone a good way, he told me he would fight him for a farthing. While we were deliberating upon what was to be done, a hackney coachman, driving softly along and perceiving us standing by the kennel, came up close to us, and calling, "A coach, master!" by a dexterous management of the reins made his horses stumble in the wet, and bedaub us all over with mud. After which exploit he drove on, applauding himself with a hearty laugh, in which several people joined, to my great mortification. But one, more compassionate than the rest, seeing us strangers, advised me to go into an alehouse and dry myself. I thanked him for his advice, which I immediately complied with, and going into the house he pointed out, called for a pot of beer, and sat down by a fire in the public room where we cleaned ourselves as well as we could. In the meantime, a wag who sat in a box, smoking his pipe, understanding, by our dialect, that we were from Scotland, came up to me, and with a grave countenance asked how long I had been caught. As I did not know the meaning of this question, I made no answer, and he went on, saying it could not be a great while, for my tail was not yet cut, at the same time taking hold of my hair, and tipping the wink to the rest of the company, who seemed highly entertained with his wit. I was incensed at this usage, but afraid of resenting it, because I happened to be in a strange place, and perceived the person who spoke to me was a brawny fellow, for whom I thought myself by no means a match. However, Strap, having either more courage or less caution, could not put up with the insults I suffered, but told him in a peremptory tone he was an uncivil fellow for making so free with his betters. Then the wit, going toward him, asked him what he had got in his knapsack. "Is it oatmeal or brimstone, Sawney?" said he, seizing him by the chin, which he shook, to the inexpressible diversion of all present. My companion, feeling himself assaulted in such an opprobrious manner, disengaged himself in a trice, and lent his antagonist such a box on the ear as made him stagger to the other side of the room, and in a moment a ring was formed for the combatants. Seeing Strap beginning to strip, and my blood being heated with indignation which banished all other thoughts, I undressed myself to the skin in an instant, and declared that as the affront that occasioned the quarrel was offered to me, I would fight it out myself. Upon which one or two cried out, "That's a brave Scotch boy. You shall have fair play." His assurance gave me fresh spirits, and going up to my adversary, who by his pale countenance did not seem much inclined to the battle, I struck him so hard on the stomach that he reeled over a bench and fell to the ground. Then I attempted to keep him down, in order to improve my success, according to the manner of my own country, but was restrained by the spectators, one of whom endeavored to raise up my opponent, but in vain, for he protested he would not fight, for he was not quite recovered of a late illness. I was very well pleased with this excuse, and immediately dressed myself, having acquired the good opinion of the company for my bravery, as well as of my comrade Strap, who shook me by the hand and wished me joy of the victory. After having drunk our pot and dried our clothes, we inquired of the landlord if he knew Mr. Cringer, the member of Parliament, and were amazed at his replying in the negative. For we imagined he must be altogether as conspicuous here as in the borough he represented. But he told us we might possibly hear of him as we passed along. We betook ourselves therefore to the street, where seeing a footman standing at the door, we made up to him, and asked if he knew where our patron lived. This member of the party-colored fraternity, surveying us both very minutely, said he knew Mr. Cringer very well, and bade us turn down the first street on our left, then turn to the right, and then to the left again, after which perambulation we would observe a lane, through which we must pass, and at the other end we should find an alley that leads to another street, where we should see the sign of the Thistle and 3 Peddlers, and there he lodged. We thanked him for his information, and went forwards, Strap telling me that he knew this person to be an honest, friendly man by his countenance, before he opened his mouth. In which opinion I acquiesced, ascribing his good manners to the company he daily saw in the house where he served. We followed his directions punctually, in turning to the left and to the right, and to the left again, but instead of seeing a lane before us, found ourselves at the side of the river, a circumstance that perplexed us not a little, and my fellow traveler ventured to pronounce that we had certainly missed our way. By this time we were pretty much fatigued with our walk, and not knowing how to proceed, I went into a small snuff shop hard by, encouraged by the sign of the Highlander, where I found, to my inexpressible satisfaction, the shopkeeper was my countryman. He was no sooner informed of our peregrination, and the directions we had received from the footman, than he informed us we had been imposed upon, telling us, Mr. Cringer lived in the other end of the town, and that it would be to no purpose for us to go thither today, for by that time he was gone to the house. I then asked if he could recommend us a lodging. He really gave us a line to one of his acquaintance, who kept a chandler's shop not far from St. Martin's Lane. There we hired a bedroom, up 2 pair of stairs, at the rate of 2 shillings per week, so very small that when the bed was let down, we were obliged to carry out every other piece of furniture that belonged to the apartment, and use the bedstead by way of chairs. About dinner time, our landlord asked how we proposed to live, to which interrogation we answered that we would be directed by him. Well then, says he, there are 2 ways of eating in this town for people of your condition, the one more creditable and expensive than the other. The first is to dine at an eating house frequented by well-dressed people only, and the other is called diving, practiced by those who are either obliged or inclined to live frugally. I gave him to understand that, provided the last was not infamous, it would suit much better with our circumstances than the other. Infamous, cried he, not at all. There are many creditable people, rich people, aye, and fine people that dive every day. I have seen many a pretty gentleman with a laced waistcoat dine in that manner very comfortably for 3 pence halfpenny, and go afterwards to the coffee house, where he made a figure with the best lord in the land. But your own eyes shall bear witness. I will go along with you today and introduce you. He accordingly conducted us to a certain lane, where stopping, he bade us observe him, and do as he did, and, walking a few paces, dived into a cellar and disappeared in an instant. I followed his example, and descending very successfully, found myself in the middle of a cook's shop, almost suffocated with the steams of boiled beef, and surrounded by a company of hackney coachmen, chairmen, draymen, and a few footmen out of place or on board wages, who sat eating shin of beef, tripe, cow heel, or sausages, at separate boards, covered with cloths which turned my stomach. While I stood in amaze, undetermined whether to sit down or walk upwards again, Strap, in his descent, missing one of the stops, tumbled headlong into this infernal ordinary, and overturned the cook as she carried a porringer of soup to one of the guests. In her fall, she dashed the whole mess against the legs of a drummer belonging to the foot guards, who happened to be in her way, and scalded him so miserably that he started up and danced up and down, uttering a volley of execrations that made my hair stand on end. While he entertained the company in this manner, with an eloquence peculiar to himself, the cook got up, and after a hearty curse on the poor author of this mischance, who lay under the table with a woeful countenance, emptied a salt cellar in her hand, and stripping down the patient's stocking, which brought the skin along with it, applied the contents to the sore. This poultice was scarce laid on, when the drummer, who had begun to abate of his exclamations, broke forth into such a hideous yell as made the whole company tremble. Then, seizing a pewter pint-pot that stood by him, squeezed the sides of it together, as if it had been made of pliant leather, grinding his teeth at the same time with a most horrible grin. Guessing the cause of this violent transport, I bade the woman wash off the salt and bathe the part with oil, which she did, and procured him immediate ease. But here another difficulty occurred, which was no other than the landlady's insisting on his paying for the pot he had rendered useless. He said he would pay for nothing but what he had eaten, and bade her be thankful for his moderation, or else he would prosecute her for damages. Strap, foreseeing the whole affair would lie at his door, promised to satisfy the cook, and called for a dram of gin to treat the drummer, which entirely appeased him and composed all animosities. After this accommodation, our landlord and we sat down at a board, and dined upon shin of beef most deliciously, our reckoning amounting to 2 halfpenny each, bread and small beer included. Chapter 14. We visit Strap's friend, a description of him, his advice, we go to Mr. Cringer's house, are denied admittance. An accident befalls Strap. His behavior thereupon. An extraordinary adventure occurs, in the course of which I lose all my money. In the afternoon, my companion proposed to call at his friend's house, which, we were informed, was in the neighborhood, whither we accordingly went, and were so lucky as to find him at home. This gentleman, who had come from Scotland 3 or 4 years before, kept a school in town, where he taught the Latin, French, and Italian languages. But what he chiefly professed was the pronunciation of the English tongue, after a method more speedy and uncommon than any practiced heretofore. And indeed, if his scholars spoke like their master, the latter part of his undertaking was certainly performed to a tittle. For although I could easily understand every word of what I had heard hitherto since I entered England, 3 parts in 4 of his dialect were as unintelligible to me as if he had spoken in Arabic or Irish. He was a middle-sized man, and stooped very much, though not above the age of 40. His face was frightfully pitted with the smallpox, and his mouth extended from ear to ear. He was dressed in a nightgown of plaid, fastened about his middle with a sergeant's old sash, and a tie periwig with a foretop 3 inches high, in the fashion of King Charles II's reign. After he had received Strap, who was related to him, very courteously he inquired of him who I was, and being informed, he took me by the hand, telling me he was at school with my father. When he understood my situation, he assured me that he would do me all the service in his power, both by his advice and otherwise, and while he spoke these words eyed me with great attention, walking round me several times and muttering, "Oh, dear. Oh, dear. Fat Sate is here." I soon guessed the reason of his ejaculation and said, "I suppose, sir, you are not pleased with my dress." "Dress," answered he, "you may call it fat you please in your country, but I vow to gad 'tis a masquerade here. No Christian will admit such a figure into his house. Upon my conscience, I wonder the dogs did not hunt you. Did you pass through St. James's Market?" Bless my eyesight. You are like a cousin German of an orangutan. I began to be a little serious at this discourse, and asked him if he thought I should obtain entrance tomorrow at the house of Mr. Cringer, on whom I chiefly depended for an introduction into business. Mr. Cringer, Mr. Cringer, replied he, scratching his cheek, may be a very honest gentleman, I know nothing to the contrary, but is your sole dependence upon him. Who recommended you to him? I pulled out Mr. Crabbe's letter, and told him the foundation of my hopes, at which he stared at me and repeated, "Oh dear." Oh dear. I began to conceive bad omens from this behavior of his, and begged he would assist me with his advice, which he promised to give very frankly, and as a specimen directed us to a periwig warehouse in the neighborhood in order to be accommodated, laying strong injunctions on me not to appear before Mr. Cringer till I had parted with my carroty locks, which, he said, were sufficient to beget an antipathy against me in all mankind. And as we were going to pursue this advice, he called me back and bade me be sure to deliver my letter into Mr. Cringer's own hand. As we walked along, Strap triumphed greatly in our reception with his friend, who, it seems, had assured him he would in a day or two provide for him with some good master. "Aye, and now," says he, "you will see how I will fit you with a wig. There's ne'er a barber in London, and that's a bold word, can palm a rotten caul, or a pennyweight of dead hair, upon me." And indeed, this zealous adherent did wrangle so long with the merchant, that he was desired 20 times to leave the shop, and see if he could get one cheaper elsewhere. At length I made choice, if a good handsome bob, for which I paid 10 shillings, and returned to our lodging, where Strap in a moment rid me of that hair which had given the schoolmaster so much offence. We got up next day betimes, having been informed that Mr. Cringer gave audience by candlelight to all his dependents, he himself being obliged to attend the levee of my Lord Terrier at break of day, because his lordship made one at the Minister S between 8 and 9 o'clock. When we came to Mr. Cringer's door, Strap, to give me all instance of his politeness, ran to the knocker, which he employed so loud and so long that he alarmed the whole street, and a window opening in the second story of the next house, a vessel was discharged upon him so successfully that the poor barber was wet to the skin, while I, being luckily at some distance, escaped the unsavory deluge. In the meantime, a footman opening the door and seeing nobody in the street but us, asked, with a stern countenance, if it was I who made such a noise, and what I wanted. I told him I had business with his master, whom I desired to see. Upon which he slapped the door in my face, telling me I must learn better manners before I could have access to his master. Vexed at this disappointment, I turned my resentment against Strap, whom I sharply reprimanded for his presumption. But he, not in the least regarding what I said, wrung the wet out of his periwig, and lifting up a large stone, flung it with such force against the street door of that house from whence he had been bedewed, that the lock giving way, it flew wide open, and he took to his heels, leaving me to follow him as I could. Indeed, there was no time for deliberation. I therefore pursued him with all the speed I could exert, until we found ourselves about the dawn in a street we did not know. Here, as we wandered along gaping about, a very decent sort of a man, passing by me, stopped of a sudden and took up something, which having examined, he turned and presented to me with these words, "Sir, you have dropped 1/2 crown." I was not a little surprised at this instance of honesty, and told him it did not belong to me, but he bade me recollect, and see if all my money was safe. Upon which I pulled out my purse, for I had bought one since I came to town, and reckoning my money in my hand, which was now reduced to 5 guineas 7 shillings and 2pence, assured him I had lost nothing. "Well then," says he, "so much the better. This is a godsend, and as you two were present when I picked it up, you are entitled to equal shares with me." I was astonished at these words, and looked upon this person to be a prodigy of integrity, but absolutely refused to take any part of the sum. "Come, gentlemen," said he, "you are too modest. I see you are strangers, but you shall give me leave to treat you with a whet this cold raw morning." I would have declined the invitation, but Strap whispered to me that the gentleman would be affronted, and I complied. "Where shall we go?" said the stranger. "I am quite ignorant of this part of the town." I informed him that we were in the same situation, upon which he proposed to go into the first public house we should find open, and as we walked together, he began in this manner. "I find by your tongues you are from Scotland, gentlemen. My grandmother by the father's side was of your country, and I am so prepossessed in its favor that I never meet a Scotchman but my heart warms. The Scots are very brave people. There is scarce a great family in the kingdom that cannot boast of some exploits performed by its ancestors many hundred years ago. There's your Douglases, Gordons, Campbells, Hamiltons. We have no such ancient families here in England. Then you are all very well educated. I have known a peddler talk in Greek and Hebrew, as well as if they had been his mother tongue. And for honesty, I once had a servant, his name was Gregor MacGregor. I would have trusted him with untold gold. This eulogium of my native country gained my affections so strongly that I believe I could have gone to death to serve the author, and Strap's eyes swam in tears. At length, as we passed through a dark, narrow lane, we perceived a public house, which we entered, and found a man sitting by the fire, smoking a pipe, with a pint of purl before him. Our new acquaintance asked us if ever we had drunk egg flip. To which question we answering in the negative, he assured us of a regale, and ordered a quart to be prepared, calling for pipes and tobacco at the same time. We found this composition very palatable, and drank heartily. The conversation, which was introduced by the gentleman, turning upon the snares that young, inexperienced people are exposed to in this metropolis. He described 1,000 cheats that are daily practiced upon the ignorant and unwary, and warned us of them with so much good nature and concern that we blessed the opportunity which threw us in his way. After we had put the can about for some time, our new friend began to yawn, telling us he had been up all night with a sick person, and proposed we should have recourse to some diversion to keep him awake. "Suppose," said he, "we should take a hand at whist for pastime." "But let me see. That won't do, there's only 3 of us, and I cannot play at any other game." The truth is, I seldom or never play, but out of complacence, or at such a time as this, when I am in danger of falling asleep. Although I was not much inclined to gaming, I felt no aversion to pass an hour or 2 at cards with a friend, and knowing that Strap understood as much of the matter as I, made no scruple of saying, "I wish we could find a 4th hand." While we were in this perplexity, the person whom we found in the house at our entrance, overhearing our discourse, took the pipe from his mouth very gravely, and accosted us thus: "Gentlemen, my pipe is out, you see," shaking the ashes into the fire, "and rather than you should be balked, I don't care if I take a hand with you for a trifle, but remember I won't play for anything of consequence." We accepted his proffer with pleasure. Having cut for partners, it fell to my lot to play with him against our friend and Strap, for 3d a game. We were so successful that in a short time I was half a crown gainer, when the gentleman whom we had met in the street, observing he had no luck today, proposed to leave off or change partners. By this time I was inflamed with my good fortune and the expectation of improving it, as I perceived the 2 strangers played but indifferently. Therefore I voted for giving him his revenge, And cutting again, Strap and I, to our mutual satisfaction, happened to be partners. My good fortune attended me still, and in less than an hour we had got 30 shillings of their money, for as they lost they grew the keener, and doubled stakes every time. At last the inconstant goddess began to veer about, and we were very soon stripped of all our gains, and about 40 shillings of our own money. This loss mortified me extremely, and had a visible effect on the muscles of Strap's face, which lengthened apace. But our antagonists, perceiving our condition, kindly permitted us to retrieve our loss and console ourselves with a new acquisition. Then my companion wisely suggested it was time to be gone, upon which the person who had joined us in the house began to curse the cards, and muttered that we were indebted to fortune only for what we had got, no part of our success being owing to our good play. This insinuation nettled me so much that I challenged him to a game at piquet for a crown, and he was with difficulty persuaded to accept the invitation. This contest ended in less than an hour to my inexpressible affliction, who lost every shilling of my own money, Strap absolutely refusing to supply me with a sixpence. The gentleman at whose request we had come in, perceiving by my disconsolate looks the situation of my heart, which well-nigh burst with grief and resentment, when the other stranger got up, and went away with my money, began in this manner. I am truly afflicted at your bad luck, and would willingly repair it, were it in my power. But what in the name of goodness could provoke you to tempt your fate so long? It is always a maxim with gamesters to pursue success as far as it will go, and to stop whenever fortune shifts about. You are a young man, and your passions are too impetuous. You must learn to govern them better. However, there is no experience like that which is bought. You will be the better for this the longest day you have to live. As for the fellow who has got your money, I don't half like him. Did not you see me tip you the wink to leave off in time? I answered. No, no, continued he. You was too eager to mind anything but the game. But harkee, said he in a whisper, are you satisfied of that young man's honesty? His looks are a little suspicious, but I may be mistaken. He made a great many grimaces while he stood behind you. This is a very wicked town. I told him I was very well convinced of my comrade's integrity, and that the grimaces he mentioned were doubtless owing to his anxiety of my loss. Oh-ho. If that be the case, I ask his pardon. Landlord, see what's to pay. The reckoning amounted to 18 pence, which, having discharged, the gentleman shook us both by the hand, and, saying he should be very glad to see us again, departed. Chapter 15. Strap moralizes, presents his purse to me. We inform our landlord of our misfortune. He unravels the mystery. I present myself to Cringer. He recommends and turns me over to Mr. Staytape. I become acquainted with a fellow dependent, who explains the character of Cringer and Staytape, and informs me of the method to be pursued at the Navy Office and Surgeon's Hall. Strap is employed in our way to our lodging. After a profound silence on both sides, Strap, with a hideous groan, observed that we had brought our pigs to a fine market. To this observation I made no reply, and he went on. God send us well out of this place. We have not been in London 48 hours, and I believe we have met with 40,000 misfortunes. We have been jeered, reproached, buffeted, and at last stripped of our money, and I suppose by and by we shall be stripped of our skins. Indeed, as to the money part of it, that was owing to our own folly. Solomon says, "Bray a fool in a mortar, and he will never be wise." Ah, God help us, an ounce of prudence is worth a pound of gold. This was no time for him to tamper with my disposition, already mad with my loss, and inflamed with resentment against him for having refused me a little money to attempt to retrieve it. I therefore turned towards him with a stern countenance, and asked who he called fool. Being altogether unaccustomed to such looks from me, he stood still and stared in my face for some time, then, with some confusion, uttered, "Fool." I called nobody fool but myself. I am sure I am the greatest fool of the two, for being so much concerned at other people's misfortunes. But nemo omnibus horis sapit, that's all, that's all. Upon which a silence ensued, which brought us to our lodging, where I threw myself upon the bed in an agony of despair, resolved to perish rather than apply to my companion, or any other body, for relief. But Strap, who knew my temper and whose heart bled within him for my distress, after some pause came to the bedside, and putting a leathern purse into my hand, burst into tears, crying, "I know what you think, but I scorn your thought. There's all I have in the world. Take it, and I'll perhaps get more for you before that be done. If not, I'll beg for you, steal for you, go through the wide world with you, and stay with you. For though I be a poor cobbler's son, I am no scout." I was so much touched with the generous passion of this poor creature that I could not refrain from weeping also, and we mingled our tears together for some time. Upon examining the purse, I found in it 2 half-guineas and half a crown, which I would have returned to him, saying he knew better than I how to manage it, but he absolutely refused my proposal and told me it was more reasonable and decent that he should depend upon me, who was a gentleman, than that I should be controlled by him. After this friendly contest was over, and our minds more at ease, we informed our landlord of what had happened to us, taking care to conceal the extremity to which we were reduced. He no sooner heard the story than he assured us we had been grievously imposed upon by a couple of sharpers, who were associates, and that this polite, honest, friendly, humane person who had treated us so civilly was no other than a rascally money-dropper, who made it his business to decoy strangers in that manner to one of his own haunts, where an accomplice or two were always waiting to assist in pillaging the prey he had run down. Here the good man recounted a great many stories of people who has been seduced, cheated, pilfered, beat, nay, even murdered by such villains. I was confounded at the artifice and wickedness of mankind, and Strap, lifting up his eyes and hands to heaven, prayed that God would deliver him from such scenes of iniquity, for surely the devil had set up his throne in London. Our landlord being curious to know what reception we had met with at Mr. Cringer S., we acquainted him with the particulars, at which he shook his head, and told us we had not gone the right way to work, that there was nothing to be done with a member of Parliament without a bribe, that the servant was commonly infected with the master's disease and expected to be paid for his work, as well as his betters. He therefore advised me to give the footman a shilling the next time I should desire admittance to my patron, or else I should scarce find an opportunity to deliver my letter. Accordingly, next morning, when the door was opened, I slipped a shilling into his hand and told him I had a letter for his master. I found the good effect of my liberality, for the fellow let me in immediately, and, taking the letter out of my hand, desired me to wait in a kind of passage for an answer. In this place I continued standing for 3/4 of an hour, during which time I saw a great many young fellows whom I formerly knew in Scotland pass and repass, with an air of familiarity, in their way to and from the audience chamber, while I was fain to stand shivering in the cold, and turn my back to them that they might not perceive the lowness of my condition. At length Mr. Cringer came out to see a young gentleman to the door, who was no other than Squire Gawky, dressed in a very gay suit of clothes. At parting, Mr. Cringer shook him by the hand, and told him he hoped to have the pleasure of his company at dinner. then turning about towards me, asked what were my commands. When he understood I was the person who had brought the letter from Mr. Crabbe, he affected to recollect my name, which, however, he pretended he could not do till he had consulted the letter again. To save him the trouble, I told him my name was Random. Upon which he went on, Random, Random, Random. I think I remember the name. And very well he might, for this very individual Mr. Cringer had many a time rode before my grandfather's cloak-bag, in quality of a footman. "Well," says he, "you propose to go on board a man-o'-war as surgeon's mate." I replied by a low bow. "I believe it will be a difficult matter," continued he, "to procure a warrant, there being already such a swarm of Scotch surgeons at the Navy Office, in expectation of the next vacancy, that the commissioners are afraid of being torn to pieces, and have actually applied for a guard to protect them. However, some ships will soon be put in commission, and then we shall see what's to be done." So saying, he left me, exceedingly mortified at the different reception Mr. Gawky and I had met with from this upstart, proud, mean member, who, I imagined, would have been glad of an opportunity to be grateful for the obligations he owed to my family. At my return, I was surprised with the agreeable news of Strap's being employed, on the recommendation of his friend, the schoolmaster, by a periwig maker in the neighborhood, who allowed him 5 shillings per week besides bed and board. I continued to dance attendance every other morning at the levee of Mr. Cringer during a fortnight, in which time I became acquainted with a young fellow of my own country and profession, who also depended on the member's interest, but was treated with much more respect than I, both by the servants and master, and often admitted into a parlor, where there was a fire for the convenience of the better sort of those who waited for him. Thither I was never permitted to penetrate, on account of my appearance, which was not at all fashionable, but was obliged to stand blowing my fingers in a cold lobby and take the first opportunity of Mr. Cringer's going to the door to speak with him. One day, while I enjoyed this occasion, a person was introduced, whom Mr. Cringer no sooner saw than, running towards him, he saluted him with a low bow to the very ground, and afterwards shaking him by the hand with great heartiness and familiarity, called him his good friend, and asked very kindly after Mrs. Statape and the young ladies. Then, after a whisper, which continued some minutes, wherein I overheard the word honor, repeated several times with great emphasis, Mr. Cringer introduced me to this gentleman, as to a person whose advice and assistance I might depend upon, and having given me his direction, followed me to the door, where he told me I need not give myself the trouble to call at his house any more, for Mr. Statape would do my business. At that instant my fellow dependent, coming out after me, overheard the discourse of Mr. Cringer, and making up to me in the street, accosted me very civilly. This address I looked upon as no small honor, considering the figure he made, for he was dressed in a blue frock with a button, a green silk waistcoat, trimmed with gold, black velvet breeches, white silk stockings, silver buckles, a gold-laced hat, a spencer wig, and a silver-hilted hanger, with a fine clouded can in his hand. "I perceive," says he, "you are but lately come from Scotland. Pray, what may your business with Mr. Cringer be? I suppose it is no secret, and I may possibly give you some advice that will be serviceable, for I have been surgeon's second mate on board of a 70-gun ship, and consequently know a good deal of the world." I made no scruple to disclose my situation, which, when he had learned, he shook his head, and told me he had been pretty much in the same circumstances about a year ago, that he had relied on Cringer's promises until his money, which was considerable, as well as his credit, was quite exhausted, And when he wrote to his relations for a fresh supply, instead of money, he received nothing but reproaches, and the epithets of idle, debauched fellow. That after he had waited at the Navy office many months for a warrant to no purpose, he was fain to pawn some of his clothes, which raised a small sum wherewith he bribed the secretary, who soon procured a warrant for him, notwithstanding he had affirmed the same day that there was not one vacancy. That he had gone on board, where he remained 9 months, at the end of which the ship was put out of commission, and he said the company were to be paid off in Broad Street the very next day. That relations, being reconciled to him, had charged him to pay his devoirs regularly to Mr. Cringer, who had informed them by letter that his interest alone had procured the warrant, in obedience to which command he came to his levee every morning, as I saw, though he looked upon him to be a very pitiful scoundrel. In conclusion, he asked me if I had yet passed at Surgeons' Hall. To which question I answered, I did not so much as know it was necessary. "Necessary?" cried he. "Oh, then I find I must instruct you. Come along with me, and I'll give you information about that matter." So saying, he carried me into an ale-house, where I called for some beer and bread and cheese, on which we breakfasted. While we sat in this place, he told me I must first go to the Navy office and write to the board, desiring them to order a letter for me to Surgeons' Hall, that I might be examined, touching my skill in surgery. That the surgeons, after having examined me, would give me my qualifications sealed up in form of a letter directed to the commissioners, which qualification I must deliver to the secretary of the board, who would open it in my presence and read the contents. After which I must employ my interest to be provided for as soon as possible. That the expense of his qualification for second mate of a third rate amounted to 13 shillings, exclusive of the warrant, which cost him half a guinea and half a crown, besides a present to the secretary, which consisted of a £3 12 piece. This calculation was like a thunderbolt to me, whose whole fortune did not amount to 12 shillings. I accordingly made him acquainted with this part of my distress, after having thanked him for his information and advice. He condoled me on this occasion, but bade me be of good cheer, for he had conceived a friendship for me and would make all things easy. He was ran out at present, but tomorrow or next day he was certain of receiving a considerable sum, of which he would lend me what would be sufficient to answer my exigencies. This frank declaration pleased me so much that I pulled out my purse and emptied it before him, begging him to take what he pleased for pocket expense until he should receive his own money. With a good deal of pressing, he was prevailed upon to take 5 shillings, telling me that he might have what money he wanted at any time for the trouble of going into the city. But as he had met with me, he would defer his going thither till tomorrow, when I should go along with him, and he would put me in the way of acting for myself, without a servile dependence on that rascal Cringer, much less on the tailor to whom he heard him turn me over. "How," cried I, "is Mr. Staytape a tailor?" "No less, I assure you," answered he, "and, I confess, more likely to serve you than the member, for provided you can entertain him with politics and conundrums, you may have credit with him for as many and as rich clothes as you please." I told him I was utterly ignorant of both, and so incensed at Cringer's usage that I would never set foot within his door again. After a good deal more conversation, my new acquaintance and I parted, having made an appointment to meet next day at the same place, in order to set out for the city. I went immediately to Strap and related everything which had happened, but he did not at all approve of my being so forward to lend money to a stranger, especially as we had already been so much imposed upon by appearances. "However," said he, "if you are sure he is a Scotchman, I believe you are safe.